Everyone, and welcome to the Vandenberg series on the future of conservative foreign policy. In this series, we interview leading national security professionals and strategists on their vision for the future of conservative foreign policy. This series provides a forum for serious debate, dialogue, and discussion. And today we are thrilled to welcome former Deputy National Security Advisor and Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, Dr. Nadia Schadlow. Dr. Schadlow played the leading role in drafting the president's 2017 National Security Strategy, which is the president's most important strategic national security document. The National Security Strategy, or NSS, outlines the president's foreign policy doctrine, and we look forward to discussing this and many other issues with Nadia momentarily. I want to remind all of our listeners that they can submit questions at any point to the chat or Q&A box, and we will collect those questions and then ask them at the conclusion of our interview. So with that, I think we can dive right in. Thank you so much for being here again today, Nadia. We greatly appreciate it. And we've been expecting the new Biden national security strategy for some time now. There has been talk that it has been delayed because of the ongoing crisis in Ukraine and may be reworked as a result of Putin's invasion. What do you think we can expect to see in the Biden NSS, and will we see that soon?
Well, thanks, Amanda. I will answer the question, or attempt to, but I would like to say that it's a pleasure to be here. And in particular, thank you for your service. We worked together. You made a great contribution to the 2017 NSS, and I'm glad that we have a chance to spend some time together. So thanks. So, I don't envy the Biden administration now. I think probably the drafters are, it's a tough spot for them to be in. The interim guidance, I think, came out about a year ago, if I'm correct. At that time, I think that I think there will be pressure at least to make some shifts from that guidance. So one of the key features of that guidance was, of course, China. China as a pacing threat, China as a long-term and medium-term strategic competitor to the United States. I think the interim guidance got that right. I think there's a strong China team on the NSC and in different parts of the Biden administration. But I do think there are some problems that they're going to have to grapple with now as they redraft. Overall, should the guidance have to change that much from the March 21 document? I would say ideally not, right? Ideally, you want to have the fundamentals of what makes the international system tick or not tick, right? And I think in that sense, some of the things they got wrong, and maybe now there'll be an opportunity to correct them. One, there was a real emphasis on diplomacy in the document, in the original document, phrases such as lead from diplomacy, leading from diplomacy. Now, there's nothing wrong with diplomacy, but diplomacy is a tool that rests on power, right? You need to lead with power, and diplomacy follows. And diplomacy becomes actually a more effective tool. But undergirding diplomacy is power. So I don't think there was enough emphasis on that in the document. I think there was also a conflation with a lot of inchoate threats, climate, transnational disruptions, threats that aren't linked to specific adversaries, competitors, or states, right? So I think it's really important to recognize there are virtually no threats that I can think of that are just linked, not linked to states, right? It's states that drive those threats. It's states that have the power, states that take the decisions. They may lead to trends, but overall you need to ascribe those trends to specific states, in my view, and I think in the view of the 2017 NSS. I think another aspect of the document that they'll have to think through, but I don't think this will change, will be kind of how much we can work with China on issues like climate, and for that matter, Russia. It was really interesting to me that early, I think a couple of days before the invasion, before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the climate envoy, Secretary Kerry, had mentioned that he was still hopeful that we could cooperate with Russia on climate. I'm pretty sure that was, the furthest thing ever from Putin's mind. And so this tendency to compartmentalize, I think, is a problem. And we'll have to see what the final guidance says about that or what it alludes to.
Yeah, thank you so much. The points on the divisions within the administration on climate and China were ones that I had been thinking about as well. It'll be interesting to see how those play out in their pending NSS. What do you consider to be the most important elements from the 2017 strategy that should be carried over into the next administration's plan?
Yeah, so I mentioned power, right? I think understanding that power is what drives the international system, that it's front and center and it matters. And it's not all military power, right? It's economic, it's political, but a lot of it is military, which again is what we're seeing in the current situation. Military power still matters. It provides the stability and the framework for deterrence so that political and economic power can really flourish, right? So it is really important. The things that I would like to see or that should be kept, again, mentioning great power competition as a frame, and we're seeing that play out now as well. And that's linked to power as well. There are powers out there competing politically, militarily, and economically, and that's an enduring feature of the international system. As soon as we realize that, we're much better off, actually, because then we're more likely to develop the correct policies. We see that great power competition play out in regions. We refer to that in the 2017 strategy as the regional balances of power, and how, again, an enduring feature of the international system is for the United States to work with its allies and partners to make sure that not one country dominates those regions, whether it's Europe, whether it's Asia, whether it's Latin America. You want to see a balance, a regional balance of power using military, political, and economic means. I think another element of the old NSS, which I would keep, I don't think that will happen going forward, is that what I call a healthy skepticism of international institutions. There is no reason to double down on institutions that have failed us, and I would put the World Health Organization, in that category. That I think that we need to have a healthy skepticism of these institutions. Keep and work with the ones that actually have worked well, but also reassess the ones that are having trouble over time, and to consider whether or not we can get to the outcomes we want in other ways, right? In other ways, through coalitions of the willing, through other methods. There are very few things that have remained the same since 1945, right? Institutions shift and change, and that's a challenge that we're facing now. Another point that I would like to see is a sense of peace through strength, which I mentioned, alluded to before, and the point that alliances are as strong as its member states, right? That it's not just the United States that makes alliances strong, but that its member states matter. We're seeing that now, actually, in Europe in a positive way. The strength of the Poles and others working, and I'll give a call out to Germany in terms of its positive shift, but we'll see what is sustainable. So those are some elements of the strategy I'd like to see. There's also an emphasis on sovereignty, which was important in the 2017 NSS. I think we will not see that term, or we'll see much less of that term in the Biden NSS. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to pick up on some of your comments on burden sharing that obviously played a big role in the 2017 NSS. Sometimes the former president is criticized for perhaps undermining the NATO alliance because of his emphasis on burden sharing. For me, I always viewed that as a kind of mischaracterization of his policy. And I was wondering if you could comment a bit on the importance of the strength of member states and alliances and why that matters for US security.
Yeah, I agree, Amanda. I think a lot of the criticism had to do with tone as opposed to substance, right? Because as we all know, and I'm sure everyone on this call knows, that for at least 15 years, this has been a discussion, if not more. I'm sure my historian friends would say, Nadia, it's much more. But so I think what got the former president in trouble was sort of tone, a sense of how he approached the problem set. But fundamentally, pressure on allies, I think, now we see was probably a good thing. But ultimately, you want that desire for the strength of an alliance to come from allies themselves, because that shows their political will that shows a shared understanding of the threats we face, of the challenges we face, right? So it's not the United States imposing our idea about those threats and challenges, but it's an understanding coming from our allied partners themselves. And that's really important, especially when we might find ourselves in a situation where you have to go back to the publics, to these are democracies, to explain why we may have to use military force. So it's really important. And over time, everything takes time, right, in this field in foreign policy and national security. So even if a country decides they're going to increase defense spending by a percentage point, it takes time to actually realize the benefits of that. It takes time to actually develop the capabilities associated with that. It's not just a statement on paper of an increase of 1% or 2%. Thanks.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, that's all. Thanks.
Yeah. I just want to remind our audience members that we will be taking questions at the end of the interview. So please feel free to send those in and we will collect those and look forward to getting to them later in the conversation. So just staying on the 2017 process for just a moment, I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about what the major substantive points of contention were during that process, and how did you go about resolving them? I think folks might be interested in hearing both about the issues and the process of developing a national security strategy, which is quite a Herculean task. And you did it in the first year of the administration, which was amazing. So if you could comment on that, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think sometimes people are disappointed because obviously there's a lot about the Trump administration that was contentious. So I think people are sometimes disappointed and say, gee, wasn't this an incredibly contentious process? But actually it wasn't. There was a lot of consensus about the key themes of the document, right? Those themes were, as I mentioned before, the importance of sovereignty. Why? Because democracy is rooted within sovereign states. And the importance of borders. So, that was a theme, and there was not a lot of contentious around that theme. There was fundamentally agreement on the idea that the world is a competitive place and that the United States needed to improve its abilities in that competition. First, by acknowledging it, right, at the national level, primarily from China, but that there are political, economic, and military competitions in place, and we needed to get better about competing. There was agreement on the self-confident theme of the document as well. That was another important theme of it, that America is a great country. It's not a perfect country, but it's a great country. And that's the foundation of a strong national security posture and the foundation of a strong strategy. So that confidence. There was agreement on the themes of reciprocity, which flowed through the administration as well. The idea that we want reciprocity in trade. If you're going to have trade barriers, we're going to have trade barriers. Or on the positive side, let's reduce trade barriers but let's do it in a reciprocal way. And finally, kind of a fifth theme, also agreement, was the idea that the United States can't do everything, but we can catalyze good things. We can work with coalitions, we can lead, and we can catalyze as long as allies and partners see the world in a similar way and are willing to work with us. So those were themes that weren't often discussed in those terms, but they were sort of it's my favorite way of talking about the document in that thematic way. And there was actually quite a bit of agreement on all of them. I think, there was maybe the discussions about how to frame some of the border issues. There were discussions about how to frame some of the economic issues, right? But all of, in the end, there was fundamental agreement, and we were able to look at the former president's speeches, what he had said from April before he was elected through his UN speeches that you worked on, Amanda, his tax reform successes. So all of those were able to come into the document and help create that consensus behind it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And is there anything you would have done differently in hindsight in the 2017 NSS that you thought about later?
I think that the differences or the challenges almost come later. I think the problem with any national security strategy is the framework for implementation, right? So I think I would have I think the process worked pretty well. We were lucky. We actually had good relationships with all of the cabinet secretaries and the people that worked for them. I had very good working relationships with my counterparts at the Department of Defense. I think you had Elbridge Colby on the show. I think you had, or you will. And so, well, you know, he and I work closely together and across the departments. I think the challenges come with implementation. There's no set structure in any administration to follow up on how implementation is going. So I think that would be an important element for those on the call who care about process. And it's probably only the people in Washington, because most people outside of Washington understandably don't care about process. But I think that it's important to think about, how are you going to take these ideas and these priorities and make them real? As many of you know, well, perhaps not, but the White House and actually the National Security Council don't have as much power as people think. Power in terms of money, in terms of resources, in terms of the ability to drive things. And the National Security Council is not supposed to be involved with implementation at all. Implementation comes from the Department of Commerce, the Department of Treasury, the DOD, the Department of Defense. And so working with those departments to actually get the stuff done that's in the strategy remains a challenge. I could talk about that a little bit more too, but I don't want to interrupt.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, I'm sure our process folks appreciated a little window into that as well. Organizing U.S. foreign policy around great power competition was a central component of the 2017 NSS, and some people viewed that as a shift in the U.S. approach. How do you think the Biden team is doing on China, and where would you make adjustments, if at all?
Well, as I mentioned, I think the Biden team articulated the problem set quite well in the interim, in their interim national security guidance. I think since then you've seen top level officials also articulate the problem set well. I think the Biden team will face certain challenges, as would, frankly, a Republican administration too. You see a dichotomy really in the area of decoupling. To what degree should we and can we decouple from China? What industries, what sectors are most effective? How do you align capital in ways that are positive for US interests? Does that happen naturally? Probably not. Do you need regulatory measures in that domain? Right now, the Hill is considering several pieces of legislation which would prohibit capital from going to certain strategic sectors in China. That's bipartisan legislation. I'm not sure where the Biden administration itself is on that legislation. I suspect it's divided to a certain degree. So I think that will be a challenge. I think a second challenge, as I mentioned before, will be compartmentalizing climate and making trade-offs in that domain. I think China will, smartly will want to use its leverage in that domain, right? If they know that it's sort of first and foremost in the Biden administration's mind, I think they're likely to use that to get other things that they want. So I think they're going to have problems in that domain. But DOD has been right in calling China a pacing threat. I mean, unfortunately, as I've written in the past, I think they also need to recognize that climate is not a pacing threat. China's a pacing threat, so they're going to have to prioritize that. But there are a lot of, I think, as I mentioned before, good people on the China portfolio, smart people that have worked for a long time on these issues.
Yeah. Do you have any predictions on how you think those debates will play out? Do you think that I similarly have heard that there are really good folks, maybe on the NSC staff, who are very committed to a more aggressive approach maybe toward China, and there are other climate factions. Do you have any predictions on how those might develop over the next few months and years?
I hate to make predictions. I think that the current the current situation, the current war in Europe and Russia's invasion of Ukraine will probably kind of strengthen the position of the so-called China hawks, I think, because I think that will it's just making everyone recognize, right, that great power competition is real, power is real, the necessity of deterrence is real, all of those things. So if I had to kind of say the shift that's likely to occur, it would be more more in that way. But it's hard to make predictions, and especially hard when you're wrong to to a forum like this. The first thing anyone ever does is say, "Oh my gosh, you were completely wrong."
Oh, of course, yeah.
And a slight sympathy for the Intel community, right? That's forced to make predictions all the time, gets a lot of them wrong.
Yeah. And on the human rights and ideology issue with China, do we expect that to play a role in their national security strategy? How do you also view the importance or lack of importance of ideology in our confrontation with China? We just had the Beijing Olympics. So this is a very salient issue for our community, I think, at the moment.
Yeah, I think ideology is important. I mean, I think that there is a systemic rivalry. The EU called it a systemic rivalry, right, several years ago. And systemic rivalries are about competing systems, about political economic systems that view the world in a different way, that organize their countries and seek to organize, seek to be aligned with allies and partners that organize their societies in a similar way. So I think ideology is a key component of this rivalry. And ideology, I'm not a China expert, but ideology seems to drive the CCP very much in terms of their vision of what China should look like and China's role in the world. So it is an important factor, keeping in mind that even if we have tactical areas of agreement in certain areas, per the issues on climate, it doesn't actually change some of the systemic rivalries, the features of that rivalry. So I think it is quite important, and it's quite important for longer term issues related to the bifurcation potentially of markets, of sectors, of areas. It's happening not because really of economic reasons, but because of geopolitical and political reasons, right? That's what's driving a lot of this. Some of it doesn't actually make economic sense, right? Reshoring doesn't necessarily make economic sense, but it makes political and geopolitical sense, or nearshoring, or changes to different sectors. So much of the supply chain discussions we've seen over the past several years, Trump and Biden, have been driven by I think, what is true, that politics and geopolitics matter. And down the line, I think, the U.S. business sector also needs to recognize that. I think they're seeing that now, right? It's a huge wake-up call. But geopolitics are an enduring feature of the international system, and as such will affect economies as well.
Yeah, and this is a great segue into sort of the third portion of our discussion today on the debates within the conservative foreign policy community at the moment. There have been recent discussions about so-called Asia firsters who perhaps want to focus more intently on the threat from China. Their critics would argue at the expense of securing American interests in other regions. Other folks, want a more engaged America in more areas. How do you view that debate, and where do you see that debate going in the next few months as we approach 2024 and other election cycles?
Right. I personally, agree with what the 2017 strategy said, which said there are several regions of the world in which we need to ensure that a balance of power remains, and that's a foundation for stability. So that is not an Asia first policy. It's recognizing that in Asia, in Europe, in Latin America, we need to have regional balances of power are the foundation of stability in those regions, right? And as soon as you shift toward one, you see problems emerge in another. That doesn't mean you apply the same policies. Of course, you have different policies, different tools, different instruments. You might have allies and partners taking the lead more in one versus the other. But I think that view will end up holding, especially because we're seeing now how what's happening in Europe is likely to affect the U.S.-China relationship over the long term in different ways. So we'll probably still see that debate among conservatives, among Republicans. But I think we're likely, hopefully, to come to a place where we see it really as the 2017 NSS put it. Another debate that we are still seeing, and again might play out differently in a few months, is the value of having a forward presence in many of these places. So this essentially means, do you deploy and keep U.S. troops abroad in these regions? I personally think yes, you do, and I think we only need to see what's happening now in Ukraine, in Europe, to understand the importance of having the will and the capability there, which is part of deterrence, to act should we need to act. And that doesn't happen as quickly as we would like. So forward presence matters. I think another area of debate we're likely to see, and it will play out in different ways, is the role of government in some of these big tech competitions, right? Some people call it industrial policy. No one really likes that term. That's why I like to say, what is the appropriate role of government in these big tech competitions where many other countries are being subsidized by their governments to develop their, whether it's semiconductor industry, whether it's their advanced energy battery industry. So I think that these are all issues that we'll have to work through over the next year. And I look forward to participating and having friendly arguments with my peers on it. So
yeah, just one more question for me, and then we're going to turn to the audience Q&A. You mentioned the Ukraine crisis having an effect potentially on some of these debates within our community and maybe perhaps more broadly. How do you think the crisis in Afghanistan with the withdrawal over the summer has affected these debates or Americans' perceptions of U.S. foreign policy and strength?
I think it had a big impact. I think fundamentally it had an impact in the more amorphous sort of psychological sense, a sense that America was not a competent nation because it was done, the withdrawal was done. I think it's hard to argue that it was done with competence, right? Virtually no one thinks that. So I think it had a big impact on America's competence, and also a sense of mainly in that domain. I think also allies too, the ability to work with allies quickly. I think that created a problem as well. It saw cracks in the alliance. I think maybe Putin overthought. I mean, it ended up being, I don't think he expected then the way the alliance would respond now to Ukraine in a unified way, but I think it showed fissures in the alliance and a certain degree of American arrogance in the way that we didn't actually work with our allies to make that withdrawal happen in a smooth way. So I think it had a projection of American weakness, which was then taken advantage of.
Thank you so much, Nadia. We have a number of questions from the audience coming in, so I'm going to read a few of those now. One from Michael Allen, who you may know. He's asking, are you concerned that foreign policy bipartisanship, politics stopping at the water's edge, has been corroded or is under threat, especially given emerging generational shifts, so anti-Israel sentiment on the left, nationalist isolationism on the right?
Yeah. I am a little bit concerned, but I also am actually optimistic because I think there are great leaders out there. And I think great leaders out there that can, I think, change a lot of that, maybe not overnight, but pretty quickly, right? Leaders that are inspiring, that are thinking forward, that are willing to work across the aisle. So I think there's a next generation of leaders. I mean, I'm biased, especially on the Republican side. I see the next generation of young congressmen and women, for instance. I'm sure there's the same on the Democratic side as well. So I'm optimistic in the sense that if we get keep the right people in power, that some of those, some of that can improve. But there are fundamental disagreements, right? So it's not just, I don't always, I think we have to be careful about saying this is partisan or this is nationalist or this is populist. They're actually fundamental disagreements. And so we have to find a way to work through the roots of those disagreements. And take them seriously and not just dismiss them in the way that they're often dismissed by the media with these overarching terms. I think that that's destructive. And we should all be very careful about that, including myself. I probably have done it too sometimes. So it's really important to understand, where is this person coming from and why, and to argue the substance of it. It's hard to do because the media actually never lays out those substantive issues, or very rarely, right? You barely can understand what the source of a disagreement is on an issue. All that's discussed is that a disagreement exists. So it actually takes some work. And if there are probably some young people on this call, I think it's up to you to do your homework and to understand the sources of those differences. Thanks, Michael. I can't see you, but thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's partly what we're hoping to achieve in this series, is to try to expose some of the substantive debates and have a serious dialogue and debate. As Nadia mentioned, we'll be having Bridge Colby on in a few weeks. We'll also be having Ambassador John Bolton several weeks later. So people with different kinds of views, and we'll be talking to each of them about why they believe what they believe. So that will be something to look forward to. Another question we have here related to ideology, but not to China, is how does ideology, how ideology places a part in this compartmentalized vision of the foreign policy that you perceive in the current administration, and what is the proper conservative answer to challenge that vision? So I think this person is asking, how does ideology play a role in the development of the foreign policy of the Biden team, and how would the conservative, what would the conservative response be to that different ideology, perhaps? And perhaps this is in reference to the climate comments we were making earlier.
Yeah. I mean, so to make sure I don't do what I just criticized people for doing, I think it's important to say, I think ideology is important, but it depends how you define it, right? Fundamentally, conservatives have an opportunity to build a foundation of their foreign policy and national security policies on the foundation of confidence in the American system, confidence in the American experiment, confidence in our Constitution. Those, to me, give conservatives a lot to work with, because it's that confidence in what America stands for that provides us with a foundation then and a rationale for the national security policy to defend our interests. That those start at home. So I think we're actually off to a good start in thinking confidently about the United States, about the role it has to play in the world, the role it has played in the world, and the role it should continue to play in the world. All of those things are beginning with a position of confidence that we are a good country. We've obviously had, obviously we haven't done everything well as a country, but we have learned from the past. We continue to learn, and I think we still provide the best foundation for going forward. So I think if that's what the definition of ideology is, that would be an important starting point for us.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And another question, the 2017 NSS fundamentally reoriented post 9/11 US national security policy away from an emphasis on the Mideast counterterrorism and, quote, endless wars, to an emphasis on great power competition with the PRC and Russia. Do you agree that the Biden interim NSS broadly accepts this reorientation, even if it alters it on the margins? And if so, doesn't this demonstrate the 2017 NSS was a significant lasting pivot in post-war US foreign policy?
Okay, that's a long question.
Yes.
Well, first I should say one of the key regions in terms of regional balances of power was the Middle East, right? I failed to say that, but it's there in the document. So excuse me for failing to say that. I think if the reorientation was toward regional balances of powers, because it essentially reflected the view that even forces of terrorism, radical Islam, they emanate from regions of the world, right? So that post 9/11 shift toward regional balances of power, strikes me as the right one. If I understood the question, or maybe Amanda, you can clarify it a little bit because it was a long question.
Yeah, I think you did understand the question correctly. It may be, I tend to agree with you that I'm not sure we totally reoriented away from the Mideast, because the Mideast features does feature.
Oh yeah, and I don't think we should totally reorient away from the Middle East, right? I mean, the Middle East is still a key factor. We're seeing now how the Middle East is playing and using its oil production or decisions about that. So we shouldn't totally reorient from the Middle East. I think sometimes conservatives especially more on the more isolationist side, tend to equate orientation or national security all with military tools, right? And I think that that's a weakness on that side as well. As I mentioned throughout, they're political, economic, and military tools. And you can have debates about the nature of America's forward presence, military forces in the Middle East. But that doesn't mean, you can't, there are lots of ways to maintain a regional balance of power with military forces being, fundamental in my view to that balance. But the debate by others is about how do you maintain that balance. So
yeah, great. And I hope we got that question right for the person who was asking. Moving on to another question. So this is someone who's very interested in process, who is asking, can you talk a bit more about the mechanics of the NSS development? For example, early in the process, are scenario-based analyses or other structured analytic techniques used by NSC staff to inform thinking about drivers, trends, and options?
Yeah, I'll be brief because I do think it's probably more specific. Yes, scenario-based analytics are used, but within a framework of taking also decisions of how to structure a document, right? How to set a direction for the document, because you can spend a lot of time going through different scenarios, but you have to eventually take some decisions about how they will frame and sort of shape the document. So we began the process very much with a sense that there are 4 primary national interests that the document needed to be structured around: protect the American homeland, ensure American prosperity, the economic pillar, peace through strength, which was more of the military defense pillar, and then advance American influence, which in DC policy circles is sort of the softer pillar. Those are actually enduring interests, right? What president doesn't want to do all those things? The key difference comes in the how, comes in the policy decisions behind them. And to weigh those policy decisions and policy alternatives, that's when also scenarios come in, where you're thinking through different options. So there's a consideration of that. But remember, the NSC staff is pretty small. There isn't sort of an entire apparatus for it. So you depend a lot on your colleagues at the different departments and agencies that have more to work with.
Great, thank you. Another audience question: how should we think about the role of middle and regional powers in great power competition with China and Russia? Some are obviously aligned with us, but others are often at odds with us. Thinking, for example, of Turkey. There seems to be a divide in conservative foreign policy circles when it comes to Turkey.
Regional powers are critical to these competitions because I think a theme of this discussion has been that these great power competition plays out often in these regions, right? They're critical to those competitions. So regional powers are extremely important. Not all regions will countries want to take this a choice or make a choice between one or the other, right? The US should provide them with options, with opportunities, but ultimately it needs to come from a shared sense that their own national interests will benefit from cooperating with the United States as opposed to some of our competitors and adversaries. But those decisions, in order for that to be enduring, those decisions need to come from the powers themselves in the region. Plus, as we talked about also, allies and partners are stronger if they themselves are contributing to the balance and contributing to the political, economic, and military requirements of that balance.
Great. Yeah, I think we have time for maybe one more audience question here. If the defense budget doesn't support the goals of our national security policy, how do we execute it?
Well, the defense budget needs to support those goals. So we need a higher defense budget. And, another area of debate among conservatives, I think there's a fair, I would say, an agreement on that, right? On needing a higher defense budget. But I think there are differences in where to spend that money, right? And there are differences, and that's another, area for all of us to work through. Some that will use the current situation and identify how actually, territory matters. What we've seen is a war in which territory matters, ground forces matter, right? And you're going to see, it's a combination, but a shift also toward high tech, right? And this has been a debate in our defense budget and defense budget circles for a long time. So it will continue to play out. But no, we need a higher top line defense budget. And I think that's one area of solid agreement among this audience, probably. So we could end on a high note.
Yeah, although
we actually need to see it, right? I'm not sure we're going to see that actually. And I think that will be a difference. I'm not sure, how the Biden administration will change some of its numbers going forward. I need to read what Mackenzie Eagland has been saying at AEI, right? She's an expert on these issues, and I'm a little behind on my Mackenzie reading. So
yeah, well, we do have a few more minutes. If I could just ask one more question, maybe, because we had a few come in. One from a member of our advisory board here at Vandenberg, Mary Beth Long, who says she's a huge fan. And she's
hi, Mary Beth. It's kind of awkward to not actually be able to see anyone, but
yeah. So she's asking, what do you think is the hardest impediment to implementing even the best policy decisions, like the multilaterals, our processes and authorities, our 1940s base? Do we need to change?
Yeah, I think the hardest impediment is still it's a bureaucracy, and it's a set of obstacles and regulations and approaches that we have put on ourselves, right? So anyone trying to get things done in government realizes it really wears you down. It's really hard, and we need to actually do away with a lot of those obstacles, not create necessarily new organizations, but actually to do away with those obstacles, or create new organizations that make the old ones actually obsolete, right? But that to me, there's so much that we weigh ourselves down. We've lost a sense of individual responsibility to just get things done. It's all about sort of a worst case scenario that frames the way anything is done, right? As opposed to just trusting someone to do something, go forward, lead, and get it done. The military tries; it has more of that, can-do approach. But even the military over the years, everyone is sort of worn down by the difficulty of getting things done, which is partly why I am a skeptic on the multilateral processes, because take the US bureaucracy and, triple it, right? Even more with the European bureaucracy, right? So the ability to negotiate an agreement or get things done, it just takes, it's a lot of time. I think it's pretty interesting. I like to point out that China's successes with Belt Road Initiative primarily bilateral, right? They didn't work through multilateral institutions the whole time. They worked country by country, bilaterally, to get a set of projects done. For the most part, right? And they got a lot done, however flawed and problematic. I realize the problems with BRI, but I do think it's a contrast. So we have to have some balance between obviously working with allies and partners, coalitions of the willing, and these huge bureaucracies that just, drag us down. So thanks, Mary Beth, for that question.
Yeah, and I know Nadia has to leave at 1:15, so we will wrap there. I will say that our chat, we had a few comments in the chat while you were speaking, agreeing with you, from Ambassador Curry, Mary Beth, and others. So they definitely echo your comments in the last question. And we thank you so much for making time for our series today. It was such a delight to have you. And we thank our audience as well for being here, and we hope you will all come back. So Nadia, thank you.
Sure.
And we greatly appreciate the comments in the interview.
What would be fun in the future is you could get all of us who have been on this right together in person, and maybe we could have some sort of discussion, which might be fun with an actual live audience. So I could, say hi to Mary Beth and Kelly Curry and Michael Allen and all these people that I think are out there. So
we may do that. That's a great idea. So
okay, great.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone.